Hello, welcome once again to Ragnar Reads. This is your host, Ragnar Ulfsson. I would like to thank all the new subscribers that I have, and I hope that you would continue to enjoy the stories that I'm reading. Once again, leave in the comments any suggestions for stories, poems, etc. that you would like for me to read. Today we are continuing on with The People of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard. This will be chapters 7 through 10. So, without further ado, we shall start. Chapter 7. On to Yishma. As mists vanish before a strong wind, the cobwebs vanished from Conan's brain. With a searing curse, he leapt into the saddle, and the stallion reared, neighing beneath him. He glared up the slopes, hesitated, then turned down the trail in the direction he had been going when halted by Kempsa's trickery. But now he did not ride at a measured gait. He shook loose the reins, and the stallion went like a thunderbolt, as if frantic to loose hysteria in violent physical exertion. Across the ledge and around the crag and down the narrow trail, threading the great steep, they plunged at breakneck speed. The path followed a fold of rock, winding intermittently down from tier to tier of striated escarpment. And once, far below, Conan got a glimpse of the ruin that had fallen. A mighty pile of broken stone and boulders at the foot of a gigantic cliff. The valley floor was still far below him when he reached a long and lofty ridge that led out from the slope like a natural causeway. Out upon this he rode, with an almost sheer drop on either hand. He could trace ahead of him the trail and made a great horseshoe back into the river bed at his left hand. He cursed the necessity of traversing those miles, but it was the only way, to try to descend to the lower lap of the trail where he would be to attempt the impossible. Only a bird could get to the riverbed with a whole neck. So he urged on the wearying stallion until a clink of hooves reached his ears, welling up from below. Pulling up short and reining to the lip of the cliff, he stared down into the dry riverbed that wound along the foot of the ridge. Along that gorge rode a motley throng. Bearded men on half-wild horses, 500 strong, bristling with weapons. And Conan shouted suddenly, leaning over the edge of the cliff 300 feet above them. At his shout they reined back, and 500 bearded faces were tilted up towards him. A deep, clamorous roar filled the canyon. Conan did not waste words. "I was riding for gore," he roared. "I had not hoped to meet you dogs on the trail. Follow me as fast as your nags can push. I'm going to Yishma, and—" "Traitor!" The howl was like a dash of ice water in his face. "What?" He glared down at them, jolted speechless. He saw wild eyes blazing up at him, faces contorted with fury, fists brandishing blades. "Traitor!" they roared back wholeheartedly. "Where are the 7 chiefs held captive in Peshkarai?" "Why, in the governor's prison, I suppose," he answered. A bloodthirsty yell from 100 throats answered him, with such a waving of weapons and a clamor that he could not understand what they were saying. He beat down the din with a bull-like roar and bellowed, "What devil's play is this? Let one of you speak so I can understand what you mean." A gaunt old chief elected himself to this position, shook his tulwar at Conan as a preamble, and shouted accusingly, "You would not let us go raiding Peshkarai to rescue our brothers." "No, you fools," roared the exasperated Cimmerian. "Even if you'd breached the wall, which is unlikely, they'd have hanged the prisoners before you could reach them." "And you went alone to traffic with the governor," yelled the Afghuli, working himself into a frothing frenzy. "Well, where are the 7 chiefs?" howled the old chief, making his tulwar into a glimmering wheel of steel about his head. "Where are they? Dead!" "What?" Conan nearly fell off of his horse in surprise. "Aye, dead!" 500 bloodthirsty voices assured him. The old chief brandished his arms and got the floor again. "They were not hanged," he screeched. "A Wazuli in another cell saw them die. The governor sent a wizard to slay them by craft." "That must be a lie," said Conan. "The governor would not dare. Last night I talked with him." The admission was unfortunate. A yell of hate and accusation split the skies. Aye, you went to him alone, to betray us. It is no lie. The Wazuli escaped through the doors. The wizard burst in his entry and told the tale to our scouts whom we met in Zydar. They have been sent forth to search for you when you did not return. When they heard the Wazuli's tale, they returned with all haste to Gore, and we saddled our steeds and girt our swords. What do you fools mean to do? Demanded the Cimmerian. To avenge our brothers, they howled. Death to the Castrayas! Slay him, brothers! He is a traitor! Arrows began to rattle around him. Conan rose in his stirrups, striving to make himself heard above the tumult, and then, with a roar of mingled rage, defiance, and disgust, he wheeled and galloped back up the trail. Behind him and below him, the Afghulis came pelting, mouthing their rage, too furious even to remember that the only way they could reach the height whereon he rode was to traverse the riverbed in the other direction, make the broad bend, and follow the twisting trail up over the ridge. When they did remember this and turned back, their repudiated chief had almost reached the point where the ridge joined the escarpment. At the cliff, he did not take the trail by which he had descended, but turned off on another, a mere trace along a rock fault, where the stallion scrambled for footing. He had not ridden far when the stallion snorted and shied back from something lying in the trail. Conan stared down on the travesty of a man, a broken, shredded, bloody heap that gibbered and gnashed splintered teeth. Impelled by some obscure reason, Conan dismounted and stood looking down at the ghastly shape, knowing that he was a witness of a thing miraculous and opposed to nature. The Rakshas lifted his gory head, and his strange eyes, glazed with agony and approaching death, rested on Conan with recognition. Where are they? It was a racking croak, not even remotely resembling a human voice. Gone back to their damnable castle on Yishma, grunted Conan. They took the Devi with them. I will go, muttered the man. I will follow them. They killed Kitara. I will kill them all. The acolytes, 4 of the Black Circle, the Master himself. Kill them all. He strove to drag his mutilated frame along the rock, but not even his indomitable will could animate the gory mass longer, where the splintered bones hung together only by torn tissue and ruptured fiber. Follow them, raved Kesma, drooling a bloody slaver. Follow! I'm going to, growled Conan. I went to fetch my Afghulis, but they've turned on me. I'm going on to Yishma alone. I'll have the Devi back if I have to tear down that damned mountain with my bare hands. I didn't think the governor would dare kill my headman when I had the Devi, but it seems he did. I'll have his head for that. She's no use to me now as a hostage, but... Curse of Ysil upon them, gasped Kemsa. Go! I am dying. Wait, take my girdle. He tried to fumble with a mangled hand at his tatters, and Conan, understanding what he sought to convey, bent and drew from about his gory waist a girdle of curious aspect. Follow the golden vein through the abyss, muttered Kemsa. Wear the girdle. I had it from a Stygian priest. It will aid you, though it failed me at last. Break the crystal globe with the 4 golden pomegranates. Beware of the Master's transmutations. I am going to Gitara. She is waiting for me in hell. Ay, ya, Skelos Yar! And so he died. Conan stared down at the girdle. The hair of which it was woven was not horsehair. He was convinced it was woven of the thick black tresses of a woman. Set in the thick mesh were tiny jewels such as he had never seen before. The buckle was strangely made, in the form of a golden serpent head, flat, wedge-shaped, and scaled with curious art. A strong shudder shook Conan as he handled it, and he turned as though to cast it over the precipice. Then he hesitated, and finally buckled it about his waist, under the Picariot girdle. Then he mounted and pushed on. The sun had sunk behind the crags. He climbed the trail in the vast shadow of the cliffs that were thrown out like a dark blue mantle over valleys and ridges far below. He was not far from the crest when, edging around the shoulder of a jutting crag, he heard the clink of shod hooves ahead of him. He did not turn back. Indeed, so narrow was the path, the stallion could not have wheeled its great body upon it. He rounded the jut of the rock and came upon a portion of the path that broadened somewhat. A chorus of threatening yells broke on his ear, but his stallion pinned a terrified horse hard against the rock, and Conan caught the arm of the rider in an iron grip, checking the lifted sword in midair. "Kerem Shah," muttered Conan, red glints smoldering luridly in his eyes. The Turanian did not struggle. They sat their horses almost breast to breast, Conan's fingers locking the other's sword arm. Behind Kerem Shah filed a group of lean Araksai on gaunt horses. They glared like wolves, fingering bows and knives, but rendered uncertain because of the narrowness of the path and the perilous proximity of the abyss that yawned beneath them. "Where is the Devi?" demanded Kerem Shah. "What's it to you, you Hykarian spy?" snarled Conan. "I know you have her," answered Kerem Shah. "I was on my way northward with some tribesmen when we were ambushed by enemies in Salazar Pass. Many of my men were slain, and the rest of us harried through the hills like jackals. When we had beaten off our pursuers, we turned westward, toward Amir Jehun Pass, and this morning we came upon a Wazuli wandering through the hills. He was quite mad, but I learned much from his incoherent gibberings before he died. I learned he was the sole survivor of a band which followed a chief of the Afghulis, and a captive Kishtraya woman into a gorge behind Kurum village. He babbled much of a man in a green turban whom the Afghuli rode down, but who, when attacked by the Wazulis who pursued, smote them with a nameless doom that wiped them out as a gust of wind-driven fire wipes out a cluster of locusts. How that one man escaped, I do not know, nor did he, but I knew from his maunderings that Conan of Gore had been in Kurum with his royal captive. And as we made our way through the hills, we overtook a naked Gilzai girl bearing a gourd of water, who told us a tale of having been stripped and ravished by a giant foreigner in the garb of an Afghuli chief, who, she said, gave her garments to a Vendehan woman who accompanied him. She said you rode westward. Kerem Shah did not consider it necessary to explain that he had been on his way to keep his rendezvous with the expected troops from Sekurndam when he found his way barred by the hostile tribesmen. The road to Gurashah Valley through Shalazah Pass was longer than the road which wound through Amir Jehun Pass, but the latter traversed part of the Afghuli country, which Kerem Shah had been anxious to avoid until he came with an army. Barred from the Shalzah road, however, he had turned to the forbidden route, until news that Conan had not yet reached Afghulistan with his captive had caused him to turn southward and push on recklessly in the hope of overtaking the Cimmerian in the hills. "So you had better tell me where the Devi is," suggested Kerem Shah. "We outnumber you. Let one of your dogs knock a shaft, and I'll throw you over the cliff," Conan promised. "It wouldn't do you any good to kill me anyhow. 500 Afghulis are on my trail, and if they find you've cheated them, they'll flay you alive. Anyway, I haven't got the Devi. She's in the hands of the Black Seers of Yizhma." "Tarim!" swore Kerem Shah softly, shaking out of his poise for the first time. "Kemsa." "Kemsa's dead," grunted Conan. "His masters sent him to hell on a landslide. And now get out of my way. I'd be glad to kill you if I had the time, but I'm on my way to Yizhma." "I'll go with you," said the Turanian abruptly. Conan laughed at him. "Do you think I'd trust you, you Hykarian dog?" "I don't ask you to," returned Kerem Shah. "We both want the Devi. You know my reason. King Yggdrasil desires to add her kingdom to his empire, and herself to his seraglio. And I knew you in the days when you were a hetman of the Kozak steppes, so I know your ambition is wholesale plunder. You want to loot Vindhya and to twist out a huge ransom for Yasmina. Well, let us for the time being, without any illusion about each other, unite our forces and try to rescue the Devi from the Seers. If we succeed and live, we can fight it out to see who keeps her." Conan scrutinized the other for a moment, and then nodded, releasing the Turanian's arm. Agreed. What about your men? Kerem Shah turned to the silent Irazkai and spoke briefly. This chief and I are going to Yishma to fight the wizards. Will you go with us, or stay here to be flayed by the Afghulis who are following this man? They looked at him with eyes grimly fatalistic. They were doomed, and they knew it. Had known it ever since the singing arrows of the ambushed Dagozai had driven them back from the pass of Shalzah. The men of the lower Zybar had too many reeking blood feuds among the crag dwellers. They were too small a band to fight their way back through the hills to the villages of the border without the guidance of the crafty Turanian. They counted themselves as dead already, so they made the reply that only dead men could make. We will go with thee and die on Yishma. Then in Crom's name, let us be gone, grunted Conan, fidgeting with impatience as he stared into the blue gulfs of the deepening twilight. My wolves were hours behind me, but we've lost a devilish lot of time. Kerem Shah backed his steed from between the black stallion and the cliff, sheathed his sword, and cautiously turned the horse. Presently the band was filing up the path as swiftly as they dared. They came upon the crest nearly a mile east of the spot where Kemsa had halted the Cimmerian and the Devi. The path they had traversed was a perilous one, even for hillmen, and for that reason Conan had avoided it that day while carrying Yasmina. Though Kerem Shah, following him, had taken it supposing the Cimmerian had done likewise. Even Conan sighed with relief when the horses scrambled up over the last rim. They moved like phantom riders through an enchanted realm of shadows. The soft creak of leather, the clink of steel marked their passing. Then again the dark mountain slopes lay naked and silent in the starlight. Chapter 8. Yasmina Knows Stark Terror. Yasmina had time but for one scream when she felt herself enveloped in that crimson whirl and torn from her protector with appalling force. She screamed once, and then she had no breath to scream. She was blinded, deafened, rendered mute, and eventually senseless by the terrific rushing of the air about her. There was a dazed consciousness of dizzy height and numbing speed, a confused impression of natural sensations gone mad, and then vertigo and oblivion. A vestige of these sensations clung to her as she recovered consciousness, so she cried out and clutched wildly as though to stay a headlong and involuntary flight. Her fingers closed on soft fabric, and a relieving sense of stability pervaded her. She took cognizance of her surroundings. She was lying on a dais covered with black velvet. This dais stood in a great dim room, whose walls were hung with dusky tapestries, across which crawled dragons reproduced with repellent realism. Floating shadows merely hinted at the lofty ceiling, and gloom that lent itself to illusion lurked in the corners. There seemed to be neither windows nor doors in the walls, or else they were concealed by the nighted tapestries. Where the dim light came from, Yasmina could not determine. The great room was a realm of mysteries or shadows, and shadowy shapes in which she could not have sworn to observe movement, yet which invaded her mind with a dim and formless terror. But her gaze fixed itself on a tangible object. On another, smaller dais of jet, a few feet away, a man sat cross-legged, gazing contemplatively at her. His long black velvet robe, embroidered with gold thread, fell loosely about him, masking his figure. His hands were folded in his sleeves. There was a velvet cap upon his head. His face was calm, placid, not unhandsome, his eyes lambent and slightly oblique. He did not move a muscle as he sat regarding her, nor did his expression alter when he saw she was conscious. Yasmina felt fear crawl like a trickle of ice water down her supple spine. She lifted herself on her elbows and stared apprehensively at the stranger. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her voice sounded brittle and inadequate. "I am the master of Yishma." The tone was rich and resonant, like the mellow tones of a temple bell. "Why did you bring me here?" she demanded. Were you not seeking me? If you are one of the Black Seers, yes, she answered recklessly, believing he could read her thoughts anyway. He laughed softly, and chills crawled up and down her spine again. You would turn the wild children of the hills against the Seers of Yzma. He smiled. I have read it in your mind, princess, your weak human mind, filled with petty dreams of hate and revenge. You slew my brother! A rising tide of anger was vying with her fear. Her hands were clenched, her lithe body rigid. Why did you persecute him? He never harmed you. The priests say that the Seers are above meddling in human affairs. Why did you destroy the king of Vengia? How can an ordinary human understand the motives of a Seer? Returned the master calmly. My acolytes in the temples of Turan, who are the priests behind the priests of Taram, urged me to bestir myself in behalf of Yezdegerd. For reasons of my own, I complied. How can I explain my mystic reasons to your puny intellect? You would not understand. I understand this, that my brother died. Tears of grief and rage shook her voice. She rose upon her knees and stared at him with wide, blazing eyes, as supple and dangerous in that moment as a she-panther. As Yezdegerd desired, agreed the master calmly. For a while it was my whim to further his ambitions. Is Yezdegerd your vassal? Yasmina tried to keep the timbre of her voice unaltered. She had felt her knee pressing something hard and symmetrical under a fold of velvet. Subtly, she shifted her position, moving her hand under the fold. He's the dog that licks up the offal in the temple yard, the vassal of the god, returned the master. He did not seem to notice the actions she sought to disassemble. Concealed by the velvet, her fingers closed on what she knew was the golden hilt of a dagger. She bent her head to hide the light of triumph in her eyes. I am weary of Yezdegerd, said the master. I have turned to other amusements. Ha! With a fierce cry, Yasmina sprang like a jungle cat, stabbing murderously. Then she stumbled and slid to the floor, where she cowered, staring up at the man on the dais. He had not moved. His cryptic smile was unchanged. Trembling, she lifted her hand and stared at him with dilated eyes. There was no dagger in her fingers. They grasped a stalk of golden lotus, the crushed blossoms dropping on the bruised stem. She dropped it as if it had been a viper and scrambled away from the proximity of her tormentor. She returned to her own dais, because there, at least, was more dignified for a queen than groveling on the floor at the feet of a sorcerer, and eyed him apprehensively, expecting reprisals. But the master made no move. All substance is one to him who holds the key of the cosmos, he said cryptically. To an adept, nothing is immutable. At will, steel blossoms bloom in unnamed gardens, where flower swords flash in the moonlight. You are a devil, she sobbed. Not I, he laughed. I was born on this planet long ago. Once I was a common man, nor have I lost all human attributes in the numberless eons of my adeptship. A human steeped in the dark arts is greater than a devil. I am of human origin, but I rule demons. You have seen the lords of the Black Circle. It would blast your soul to hear from what far realm I summoned them, and from what doom I guard them with ensorcered crystal and golden serpents. But only I can rule them. My foolish Khemsa sought to make himself great. Poor fool, bursting material doors and hurtling himself and his mistress through the air from hill to hill. Yet if he had not been destroyed, his power might have grown to rival mine. He laughed again. And you, poor silly thing, plotting to send a hairy hill chief to storm Yzma. It was such a jest that I myself could have designed, and it occurred to me that you should fall in his hands, and I read in your childish mind an intention to seduce by your feminine wiles to attempt your purpose anyway. But for all your stupidity, you are a woman fair to look upon. It is my whim to keep you for my slave." The daughter of 1,000 proud emperors gasped with shame and fury at the word. "You dare not!" His mocking laughter cut like a whip across her naked shoulders. "The king dares not trample a worm in the road? Little fool, do you not realize that your royal pride is no more than a straw blown on the wind? I, who have known the kisses of the queens of hell. You have seen how I deal with a rebel." Cowed and awed, the girl crouched on the velvet-covered dais. The light grew dimmer and more phantom-like. The features of the master became shadowy. His voice took on a newer tone of command. "I will never yield to you." Her voice trembled with fear, but it carried a ring of resolution. "You will yield," he answered with horrible conviction. "Fear and pain I shall teach you. I will lash you with horror, agony to the last quivering ounce of your endurance, until you become as melted wax to be bent and molded in my hands as I desire. You shall know such discipline as no mortal woman ever knew, until my slightest command is to you as the most unalterable will of the gods. And first, to humble your pride, you shall travel back through the lost ages, and view all the shapes that have been you. I Yilak Hosa." At these words, the shadowy room swam before Yasmina's frightened gaze. The roots of her hair prickled her scalp, and her tongue clove to her palate. Somewhere a gong sounded a deep, ominous note. The dragons on the tapestries glowed like blue fire and then faded out. The master on his dais was but a shapeless shadow. The dim light gave way to soft, thick darkness, almost intangible, that pulsed with strange radiations. She could no longer see the master. She could see nothing. She had a strange sensation that the walls and ceiling had been withdrawn immensely from her. Then somewhere in the darkness, a glow began, like a firefly that rhythmically dimmed and quickened. It grew to a golden ball, and as it expanded, its light grew more intense, flaming whitely. It burst suddenly, showering the darkness with white sparks that did not illumine the shadows. But like an impression left in the gloom, a faint luminance remained, and revealed a slender, dusky shaft shooting up from the shadowy floor. Under the girl's dilated gaze, it spread, took shape. Stems and broad leaves appeared, and great black poisonous blossoms that towered above her as she cringed against the velvet. A subtle perfume pervaded the atmosphere. It was the dread figure of the black lotus that had grown up as she watched, as it grows in the haunted, forbidden jungles of Kitai. The broad leaves were murmurous with evil life. The blossoms bent towards her like sentient things, nodding serpent-like on planet stems. Etched against soft, impenetrable darkness, it loomed over her, gigantic, blackly visible in some mad way. Her brain reeled with the drugging scent, and she sought to crawl from the dais. Then she clung to it as it seemed to be pitching at an impossible slant. She cried out with terror and clung to the velvet, but she felt her fingers ruthlessly torn away. There was a sensation as all of sanity and stability crumbling and vanishing. She was a quivering atom of sentiency driven through the black, roaring, icy void by a thundering wind that threatened to extinguish her feeble flicker of animate life like a candle blown out in a storm. Then there came a period of blind impulse and movement when the atom that was she mingled and merged with myriad other atoms of spawning life in the yeasty morass of existence, molded by formative forces until she emerged again a conscious individual, whirling down an endless spiral of lives. In a mist of terror, she relived all her former existences, recognized and was again all the bodies that had carried her ego throughout the changing ages. She bruised her feet again over the long, weary road of life that stretched out behind her to the immemorial past. Back beyond the dimmest dawns of time, she crouched shuddering in primordial jungles, hunted by slavering beasts of prey. Skin-clad, she waded thigh-deep in rice swamps, battling with squawking waterfowl for the precious grains. She labored with the oxen to drag the pointed stick through the stubborn soil, and she crouched endlessly over looms and peasant huts. She saw walled cities burst into flame, and fled screaming before the slavers. She reeled naked and bleeding over burning sands, dragged at the slaver's stirrup, and she knew the grip of hot, fierce hands on her writhing flesh, the shame and agony of brutal lust. She screamed under the bite of the lash and moaned on the rack. Mad with terror, she fought against the hands that forced her head inextricably down on the bloody block. She knew the agonies of childbirth and the bitterness of love betrayed. She suffered all the woe and wrongs and brutalities that man has inflicted on women throughout the aeons. And she endured all the spite and malice of women for women. And like the flick of a fiery whip throughout was the consciousness she retained her deviship. She was all the women she had ever been, yet in her knowing she was Yasmina. This consciousness was not lost in the throes of reincarnation. At one and the same time, she was a naked slave wench groveling under the whip, and the proud Devi of Enyeha. And she suffered not only as the slave girl suffered, but as Yasmina, to whose pride the whip was like a white-hot brand. Life merged into life in flying chaos, each with its burden of woe and shame and agony, until she dimly heard her own voice screaming unbearably, like one long-drawn cry of suffering echoing down the ages. Then she awakened on the velvet-covered dais in the mystic room. In a ghostly gray light, she saw again the dais and the cryptic-robed figure seated upon it. The hooded head was bent, the high shoulders faintly etched against the uncertain dimness. She could make out no details clearly, but the hood, where the velvet cap had been, stirred a formless uneasiness in her. As she stared, there stole over her a nameless fear that froze her tongue to her palate, a feeling that it was not the master who sat so silently on that black dais. Then the figure moved and rose upright, towering above her. It stooped over her, and the long arms and their wide black sleeves bent about her. She fought against them in speechless fright, surprised by their lean hardness. The hooded head bent down towards her averted face, and she screamed, and screamed again in poignant fear and loathing. Bony arms gripped her lithe body, and from that hood looked forth a countenance of death and decay, features like rotting parchment on a moldering skull. She screamed again, and then, as those champing, grinning jaws bent towards her lips, she lost consciousness. Chapter 9. The Castle of the Wizards. The sun had risen over the white Himalayan peaks. At the foot of a long slope, a group of horsemen halted and stared upward. High above them, a stone tower poised on the pitch of the mountainside. Beyond and above that gleamed the walls of a greater keep, near the line where the snow began that capped Yzma's pinnacle. And there was a touch of unreality about the whole, purple slopes pitching up to that fantastic castle, toy-like with distance, and above it the white glistening peak shouldering the cold blue. "We'll leave the horses here," grunted Conan. "That treacherous slope is safer for a man on foot. Besides, they're done." He swung down from the black stallion, which stood with wide-braced legs and drooping head. They had pushed hard throughout the night, gnawing at scraps from saddlebags and pausing only to give the horses the rests they had to have. "That first tower is held by the acolytes of the Black Seers," said Conan. "Or so men say. Watchdogs for their masters. Lesser sorcerers. They won't sit sucking their thumbs as we climb this slope." Kerem Shah glanced up the mountain, then back the way they had come. They were already far up Yzma's side, and a vast expanse of lesser peaks and crags spread out beneath them. Amongst these labyrinths, the Turanian sought in vain for a movement of color that would betray men. Evidently, the pursuing Efgulis had lost their chief's trail in the night. "Let us go, then." They tied the wearied horses in a clump of tamarisk and without further comment turned up the slope. There was no cover. It was a naked incline, strewn with boulders not big enough to conceal a man. But they did conceal something else. The party had not gone 50 steps when a snarling shape burst from behind a rock. It was one of the gaunt, savage dogs that infested the hill villages, and its eyes glared redly. Its jaws dripped foam. Conan was leading, but it did not attack him. It dashed past him and leaped at Kerem Shah. The Turanian leapt aside, and the great dog flung itself upon the Irakzai behind him. The man yelled and threw up his arm, which was torn by the brute's fangs as it bore him backward, and the next instant half a dozen tulwars were hacking at the beast. Yet not until it was literally dismembered did the hideous creature cease its efforts to seize and rend its attackers. Kerem Shah bound up the wounded warrior's gashed arm, looked at him narrowly, and then turned away without a word. He rejoined Conan, and they renewed the climb in silence. Presently, Kerem Shah said, "Strange to find a village dog in this place." "There's no offal here," grunted Conan. Both turned their heads to glance back at the wounded warrior toiling after them among his companions. Sweat glistened on his dark face, and his lips were drawn back from his teeth in a grimace of pain. Then both looked again at the stone tower squatting above them. A slumberous quiet lay over the uplands. The tower showed no signs of life, nor did the strange pyramidal structure beyond it. But the men who toiled upward went with the tenseness of men walking on the edge of a crater. Kerem Shah had unslung the powerful Turanian bow that had killed at 500 paces, and the Irakzai looked to their own lighter and less lethal bows. But they were not within bowshot of the tower when something shot down out of the sky, without warning. It passed so close to Conan that he felt the wind of rushing wings, but it was an Irakzai who staggered and fell, blood jetting from a severed jugular. A hawk with wings like burnished steel shot up again, blood dripping from the scimitar beak, to reel again the sky as Kerem Shah's bowstring twanged. It dropped like a plummet, but no man saw where it struck the earth. Conan bent over the victim of the attack, but the man was already dead. No one spoke, unless to comment on the fact that never before had a hawk been known to swoop on a man. Red rage began to vie with fatalistic lethargy as in the wild souls of the Irakzai. Hairy fingers knocked arrows, and men glared vengefully at the tower whose very silence mocked them. But the next attack came swiftly. They all saw it. A white puffball of smoke that tumbled over the tower rim and came drifting and rolling down the slope towards them. Others followed it. They seemed harmless, mere woolly globes of cloudy foam, but Conan stepped aside to avoid contact with the first. Behind him, one of the Irakzai reached out and thrust his sword into the unstable mass. Instantly, a sharp report shook the mountainside. There was a burst of blinding flame, and then the puffball had vanished, and the too curious warrior remained only a heap of charred and blackened bones. The crisped hand still gripped the ivory sword hilt, but the blade was gone, melted and destroyed by that awful heat. Yet men standing almost within reach of the victim had not suffered except to be dazzled and half blinded by the sudden flare. "Steel touches it off," grunted Conan. "Look out, here they come." The slope above them was almost covered by the billowing spheres. Kerem Shah bent his bow and sent a shaft into the mass, and those touched by the arrow burst like bubbles and spurting flame. His men followed his example, and for the next few minutes it was as if a thunderstorm raged on the mountain slope, with bolts of lightning striking and bursting in showers of flame. When the barrage ceased, only a few arrows were left in the quivers of the archers. They pushed on grimly, over soil charred and blackened, where the naked rock had in places been turned to lava by the explosion of those diabolical bombs. Now they were almost within arrow flight of the silent tower, and they spread their line, nerves taut, ready for any horror that might descend upon them. On the tower appeared a single figure, lifting a 10-foot bronze horn. Its strident bellow roared out across the echoing slopes. like the blare of trumpets on Judgment Day. And it began to be fearfully answered. The ground trembled under the feet of the invaders, and rumblings and grindings welled up from the subterranean depths. The Iroxai screamed, reeling like drunken men on the shuddering slope, and Conan, eyes glaring, charged recklessly up the incline, knife in hand, straight at the door that showed in the tower wall. Above him the great horn roared and bellowed in brutish mockery, and then Kerem Shah drew a shaft to his ear and loosed. Only a Turanian could have made that shot. The bellowing of the horn ceased suddenly, and a thin, high scream shrilled in its place. The green-robed figure on the tower staggered, clutching at the long shaft which quivered in its bosom, and then pitched across the parapet. The great horn tumbled upon the battlement and hung precariously, and another robed figure rushed to seize it, shrieking in horror. Again the Turanian bow twanged, and again it was answered by a death howl. The second acolyte, in falling, struck the horn with his elbow and knocked it clattering over the parapet to shatter on the rocks far below. At such headlong speed had Conan covered the ground that was before the clattering echoes of the fall that had died away, he was hacking at the door. Warned by his savage instinct, he gave back suddenly as a tide of molten lead splashed down from above. But the next instant he was back again, attacking the panels with redoubled fury. He was galvanized by the fact that his enemies had resorted to earthly weapons. The sorcery of the acolytes was limited. Their necromantic resources might well be exhausted. Kerem Shah was hurrying up the slope, his hillmen behind him in a straggling crescent. They loosed as they ran, their arrows splintering against the walls or arcing over the parapet. The heavy teak portal gave way beneath the Cimmerian's assault, and he peered inside warily, expecting anything. He was looking into a circular chamber from which a stair wound upward. On the opposite side of the chamber a door gaped open, revealing the outer slope and the backs of half a dozen green-robed figures in full retreat. Conan yelled, took a step into the tower, then native caution jerked him back, and just as a great block of stone fell crushing to the floor where his foot had been an instant before. Shouting to his followers, he raced around the tower. The acolytes had evacuated their first line of defense. As Conan rounded the tower, he saw their green robes twinkling up in the mountain ahead of him. He gave chase, panting with earnest bloodlust, and behind him Kerem Shah and the Iroxai came pelting, the latter yelling like wolves at the flight of their enemies, their fatalism momentarily submerged by temporary triumph. The tower stood on the lower edge of a narrow plateau whose upward slant was barely perceptible. A few hundred yards away, this plateau ended abruptly in a chasm, which had been invisible further down the mountain. Into this chasm the acolytes apparently leapt without checking their speed. Their pursuers saw the green robes flutter and disappear over the edge. A few moments later, they themselves were standing on the brink of the mighty moat that cut them off from the castle of the Black Seers. It was a sheer-walled ravine that extended in either direction as far as they could see, apparently girdling the mountain, some 400 yards in width and 500 feet deep. And in it, from rim to rim, a strange translucent mist sparkled and shimmered. Looking down, Conan grunted. Far below him, moving across the glimmering floor which shone like burnished silver, he saw the forms of green-robed acolytes. Their outline was wavering and indistinct, like figures seen deep underwater. They walked in single file, moving towards the opposite wall. Kerem Shah knocked an arrow and sent it singing downward, but when it struck the mist that filled the chasm, it seemed to lose momentum and direction, wandering wildly from its course. "If they went down, so can we," grunted Conan, while Kerem Shah stared after his shaft in amazement. "I saw them last at this spot." Squinting down, he saw something shining like a golden thread across the canyon floor far below. The acolytes seemed to be following this thread, and there suddenly came to him Khemsa's cryptic words, "Follow the golden vein." On the brink, under his very hand as he crouched, he found it. A thin vein of sparkling gold running from an outcropping of ore to the edge down across the silvery floor. And he found something else, which had before been invisible to him because of the peculiar refraction of the light. The gold vein followed a narrow ramp which slanted down into the ravine, fitted with niches for hand and foot to hold. "Here's where they went down," he grunted to Karam Shah. "They're no adepts to waft themselves through the air. We'll follow them." It was at that instant that the man who had been bitten by the mad dog cried out horribly and leapt at Karam Shah, foaming and gnashing his teeth. The Turanian, quick as a cat on his feet, sprung aside, and the madman pitched head first over the brink. The others rushed to the edge and glared after him in amazement. The maniac did not fall plummet-like. He floated slowly down through the rosy haze like a man sinking in deep water. His limbs moved like a man trying to swim, and his features were purple and convulsed beyond the contortions of his madness. Far down at last, on the shining floor, his body settled and lay still. "There's death in that chasm," muttered Karam Shah, drawing back from the rosy mist that shimmered almost at his feet. "What now, Conan?" "On," answered the Cimmerian grimly. "These acolytes are human. If the mist doesn't kill them, it won't kill me." He hitched his belt, and his hands touched the girdle Khemsa had given him. He scowled, then smiled bleakly. He'd forgotten that girdle, yet thrice had death passed him by to strike another victim. The acolytes had reached the farther wall and were moving up it like great green flies. Letting himself upon the ramp, he descended warily. The rosy cloud lapped at his ankles, ascending as he lowered himself. It reached his knees, his thighs, his waist, his armpits. He felt as if one feels a thick, heavy fog on a damp night. With it lapping about his chin, he hesitated, and then ducked under. Instantly, his breath ceased. All air was shut off from him, and he felt his ribs caving in on his vitals. With a frantic effort, he heaved himself up, fighting for life. His head rose above the surface, and he drank in air in great gulps. Karam Shah leaned down toward him, spoke to him, but Conan neither heard nor heeded. Stubbornly, his mind fixed on what the dying Khemsa had told him. The Cimmerian groped for the gold vein, and found that he had moved off it in his descent. Several series of handholds were niched in the ramp. Placing himself directly over the thread, he began climbing down once more. The rosy mist rose about him and engulfed him. Now his head was under, but he was still drinking pure air. Above him he saw his companions staring down at him, their features blurred by the haze that shimmered above his head. He gestured for them to follow, and went down swiftly, without waiting to see whether they complied or not. Karam Shah sheathed his sword without comment and followed, and the Irakzai, more fearful of being left alone than of the terrors that might lurk below, scrambled after him. Each man clung to the golden thread as they had seen the Cimmerian do. Down the slanting ramp they went to the ravine floor and moved out across the shining level, threading the gold vein like rope walkers. It was as if they walked along an invisible tunnel through which air circulated freely. They felt death pressing in on above them and on either hand, but it did not touch them. The vein crawled up a similar ramp on the other wall, which the acolytes had disappeared, and up they went with taut nerves, not knowing what might be waiting for them among the jutting spurs of rock that fanged the lip of the precipice. It was the green-robed acolytes who awaited them, with knives in their hands. Perhaps they had reached the limits to which they could retreat. Perhaps the Stygian girdle about Conan's waist could have told them why their necromantic spells had proven so weak and so quickly exhausted. Perhaps it was knowledge of death decreed for failure that sent them leaping from among the rocks, eyes glaring and knives glittering, resorting in their desperation to material weapons. There, among the rocky fangs on the precipice lip, was no war of wizard craft. It was a whirl of blades, where real steel bit and real blood spurted, where sinewy arms dealt forthright blows that severed quivering flesh, and men went down to be trodden underfoot as the fight raged over them. One of the Irakzai bled to death among the rocks, but the acolytes were down, slashed and hacked asunder, hurled over the edge to float sluggishly down to the silver floor that shone so far below. Then the conquerors shook blood and sweat from their eyes and looked at one another. Conan and Kerim Shah stood still upright, and 4 of the Irakzai. They stood among the rocky teeth that serrated the precipice brink, and from that spot a path wound up a gentle slope to a broad stair, consisting of half a dozen steps, 100 feet across, cut out of a green jade-like substance. They led up to a broad stage or a roofless gallery of the same polished stone, and above it rose, tier upon tier, the castle of the Black Seers. It seemed to have been carved out of the sheer stone of the mountain. The architecture was faultless, but unadorned. The many casements were barred and masked with curtains within. There was no sign of life, friendly or hostile. They went up the path in silence, warily as men treading the lair of a serpent. The Irakzai were dumb, like men marching to a certain doom. Even Kerim Shah was silent. Only Conan seemed unaware of what a monstrous dislocating and uprooting of accepted thought and action their invasion constituted. What an unprecedented violation of tradition. He was not of the East, and he came of a breed who fought devils and wizards as promptly and matter-of-factly as they battled human foes. He strode up the shining stairs and across the wide green gallery straight towards the great gold-bound teak door that opened upon it. He cast but a single glance upward at the higher tiers of the great pyramidal structure towering above him. He reached a hand for the bronze prong that jutted like a handle from the door, then checked himself, grinning hardly. The handle was made in the shape of a serpent, head lifted on arched neck. Conan had a suspicion that metal head would soon come to grisly life under his hand. He struck it from the door with one blow, and its bronze clink on the glassy floor did not lessen his caution. He flipped it aside with his knife point and again turned to the door. Utter silence reigned over the towers. Far below them, the mountain slopes fell away into a purple haze of distance. The sun glittered on snow-clad peaks on either hand. High above, a vulture hung like a black dot in the cold blue of the sky. But for it, the men before the gold-bound door were the only evidence of life. Tiny figures on a green jade gallery, poised on the dizzy height, with that fantastic pile of stone towering above them. A sharp wind off the snow lashed them, whipping their tatters about. Conan's long knife, splintering through the teak panels, roused the startled echoes. Again and again he struck, hewing through polished wood and metal bands alike. Through the sundered ruins he glared into the interior, alert and suspicious as a wolf. He saw a broad chamber, the polished stone walls untapestried, the mosaic floor uncarpeted. Square, polished ebon stools and a stone dais formed the only furnishings. The room was empty of human life. Another door showed at the opposite wall. "Leave a man on guard outside," grunted Conan. "I'm going in." Kerim Shah designated a warrior for that duty, and the man fell back toward the middle of the gallery, bow in hand. Conan strode into the castle, followed by the Turanian and the 3 remaining Irakzai. The one outside spat, grumbled in his beard, and started suddenly as a low, mocking laughter reached his ears. He lifted his head and saw, on the tier above him, a tall, black-robed figure, naked head nodding silently as he stared down. His whole attitude suggested mockery and malignity. Quick as a flash, the Irakzai bent his bow and loosed. The arrow streaked upward to strike full into the black-robed breast. The mocking smile did not alter. The seer plucked out the missile and threw it back at the bowman. Not as a weapon is hurled, but with a contemptuous gesture. The Irakzai dodged, instinctively throwing up his arm. His fingers closed on the revolving shaft. Then he shrieked. In his hand, the wooden shaft suddenly writhed. Its rigid outline became pliant, melting in his grasp. He tried to throw it from him, but it was too late. He held a living serpent in his naked hand, and already it had coiled about his wrist, and its wicked, wedge-shaped head darted at his muscular arm. He screamed again, and his eyes became distended, his features purple. He went to his knees, shaken by an awful convulsion, and then lay still. The men inside had wheeled at his first cry. Conan took a swift stride towards the open doorway, then halted short, baffled. To the men behind him, it seemed that he strained against empty air. But though he could see nothing, there was a slick, smooth, hard surface under his hands, and he knew that a sheet of crystal had been let down in the doorway. Through it, he saw the Iroxai laying motionless on the glassy gallery, an ordinary arrow sticking in his arm. Conan lifted his knife and smote, and the watchers were dumbfounded to see his blow checked apparently in midair. With a loud clang of steel that meets an unyielding substance, he wasted no more effort. He knew that not even the legendary Talwar of Amir Karum could shatter that invisible curtain. In a few words, he explained the matter to Kerem Shah, and the Turanian shrugged his shoulders. Well, if our exit is barred, we must find another. In the meantime, our way lies forward, does it not? With a grunt, the Cimmerian turned and strode across the chamber to the opposite door, with a feeling of treading upon the threshold of doom. As he lifted his knife to shatter the door, it swung silently open as if of its own accord. He strode into the great hall, flanked with tall, glassy columns. 100 feet from the door began the broad jade-green steps of a stair that tapered towards the top like the side of a pyramid. What lay beyond the stair he could not tell, but between him and its shimmering foot stood a curious altar of gleaming black jade. 4 great golden serpents twined their tails about this altar and reared their wedge-shaped heads into the air, facing the 4 quarters of the compass like the enchanted guardians of a fabled treasure. But on the altar, between the arcing necks, stood only a crystal globe filled with a cloudy, smoke-like substance, in which floated 4 golden pomegranates. The sight stirred some dim recollection in his mind. Then Conan heeded the altar no longer, for on the lower steps of the stairs stood 4 black-robed figures. He had not seen them come. They were simply there, tall, gaunt, their vulture heads nodding in unison, their feet and hands hidden by their flowing garments. One lifted his arm, and the sleeve fell away, revealing his hand, and it was not a hand at all. Conan halted in mid-stride, compelled against his will. He had encountered a force differing subtly from Kemsel's mesmerism, and he could not advance, though he felt it in his power to retreat if he wished. His companions had likewise halted, and they seemed even more helpless than he, unable to move in either direction. The seer whose arm was lifted beckoned to one of the Iroxai, and the man moved towards him like one in a trance, eyes staring and fixed, blade hanging in limp fingers. As he pushed past Conan, the Cimmerian threw an arm across his breast to arrest him. Conan was so much stronger than the Iroxai that in ordinary circumstances he could have broken his spine between his hands. But now the muscular arm was brushed aside like straw, and the Iroxai moved towards the stair, treading jerkily and mechanically. He reached the steps and knelt swiftly, proffering his blade and bending his head. The seer took the sword. It flashed as he swung it up and down. The Iroxai's head tumbled from his shoulders and thudded heavily on the black marble floor. An arch of blood jetted from the severed arteries, and the body slumped over and lay with arms spread wide. Again a malformed hand lifted and beckoned, and another Iroxai stumbled stiffly to his doom. The ghastly drama was reenacted, and another headless form lay beside the first. As the third tribesman clumped his way past Conan to his death, the Cimmerian, his veins bulging in his temples with his efforts to break past the unseen barrier that held him, was suddenly aware of allied forces unseen but waking into life about him. This realization came without warning, but so powerfully that he could not doubt his instinct. His left hand slid involuntarily under his Baccarite belt and closed on the Stygian girdle. And as he gripped it, he felt new strength flood his numbed limbs. The will to live was a pulsing white-hot fire, matched by the intensity of his burning rage. The third Iroxai was a decapitated corpse, and the hideous finger was lifting again when Conan felt the bursting of the invisible barrier. A fierce, involuntary cry burst from his lips as he leapt with explosive suddenness of pent-up ferocity. His left hand gripped the sorcerer's girdle as a drowning man grips a floating log, while the long knife was a sheen of light in his right. The men on the steps did not move. They watched calmly, cynically, If they felt surprise, they did not show it. Conan did not allow himself to think what might chance when he came within knife reach for them. His blood was pounding in his temples, a mist of crimson swam above his sight. He was afire with the urge to kill, to drive his knife deep into flesh and bone and twist the blade in blood and entrails. Another dozen steps would carry him to the steps where the sneering demons stood. He drew his breath deep, his fury rising redly as his charge gathered momentum. He was hurtling past the altar with its golden serpents, when like a levin flash there shot across his mind, as vividly as if spoken in his external ear, the cryptic words of Khemsa, "Break the crystal ball." His own reaction was almost without his own volition. Execution followed impulse so spontaneously that the greatest sorcerer of the age would not have had time to read his mind and prevent the action. Wheeling like a cat from his headlong charge, he brought his knife crashing down upon the crystal. Instantly, the air vibrated with a peal of terror, whether from the stairs, the altar, or the crystal itself he could not tell. Hisses filled his ears as the golden serpents, suddenly vibrant with hideous life, writhed and smote at him. But he was fired to the speed of a maddened tiger. A whirl of steel sheared through the hideous trunks that waved towards him, and he smote the crystal sphere again and again, and the globe burst with a noise like a thunderclap, raining fiery shards on the black marble, and the gold pomegranates, as if released from captivity, shot upwards toward the lofty roof and were gone. A mad screaming, bestial and ghastly, was echoing through the great hall. On the steps writhed 4 black-robed figures, twisting in convulsions, froth dripping from their livid mouths. Then, with one frenzied crescendo of inhuman ululation, they stiffened and lay still, and Conan knew that they were dead. He stared down at the altar and the crystal shards. 4 headless serpents still coiled upon the altar, but no alien life now animated the dull, gleaming metal. Kerem Shah was rising slowly from his knees, whither he had been dashed by some unseen force. He shook his head to clear the ringing from his ears. "Did you hear that crash when you struck? It was as if 1,000 crystal panels shattered all over the castle as that globe burst. Were the souls of the wizards imprisoned in those golden balls? Ha!" Conan wheeled as Kerem Shah drew his sword and pointed. Another figure stood at the head of the stair. His robe, too, was black, but of richly embroidered velvet, and there was a velvet cap on his head. His face was calm, and not unhandsome. "Who the devil are you?" demanded Conan, staring up at him, knife in hand. "I am the master of Yimsha." His voice was like the chime of a temple bell, but a note of cruel mirth ran through it. "Where is Yasmina?" demanded Kerem Shah. The master laughed down at him. "What is that to you, dead man? Have you so quickly forgotten my strength, once lent to you, that you come armed against me, you poor fool? I think I will take your heart, Kerem Shah." He held out his hand as if to receive something, and the Turanian cried out sharply like a man in mortal agony. He reeled drunkenly, and then, with a splintering of bones, a rending of flesh and muscle, and a snapping of mail links, his breast burst outward with a shower of blood, and through the ghastly aperture something red and dripping shot through the air into the master's outstretched hand. As a bit of steel leaps to the magnet, the Turanian slumped to the floor and lay motionless, and the master laughed and hurled the object to fall before Conan's feet, a still quivering human heart. With a roar and a curse, Conan charged the stair. From Khemsa's girdle he felt strength and deathless hate flow into him to combat the terrible emanation of power that met him on the steps. The air filled with a shimmering, steely haze through which he plunged like a swimmer, head lowered, left arm bent about his face, knife gripped low in his right hand. His half-blinded eyes, glaring over the crook of his elbow, made out the hated shape of the seer before and above him, the outline wavering as a reflection wavers in disturbed water. He was racked and torn by forces beyond his comprehension, but he felt a driving power outside and beyond his own, lifting him inexorably upwards and onward, despite the wizard's strength and his own agony. Now he had reached the head of the stairs, and the master's face floated in the steely haze before him, and a strange fear shadowed the inscrutable eyes. Conan waded through the mist as though a surf, and his knife lunged upward like a live thing. The keen point ripped the master's robe as he sprang back with a low cry. Then before Conan's gaze, the wizard vanished, simply disappeared like a burst bubble, and something long and undulating darted up one of the smaller stairs that led up to the left and right from the landing. Conan charged after it, up the left-hand stair, uncertain as to what he had just seen whip up those steps, but in a berserk mood that drowned the nausea and horror whispering at the back of his consciousness. He plunged out into a broad corridor whose uncarpeted floor and untapestried walls were of polished jade, and something long and swift whisked down the corridor ahead of him and into a curtained door. From within the chamber rose a scream of urgent terror. The sound lent wings to Conan's flying feet as he hurtled through the curtains and headlong into the chamber within. A frightful scene met his glare. Yasmina cowered on the farther edge of a velvet-covered dais, screaming her loathing and horror, an arm lifted to ward off attack, while before her swayed the hideous head of a giant serpent, shining neck arching up from the dark gleaming coils. With a choked cry, Conan threw his knife. Instantly the monster whirled and was upon him like the rush of a wind through tall grass. The long knife quivered in its neck, point and a foot of blade showing on one side, and the hilt and a hand's breadth of steel on the other, but it only seemed to madden the giant reptile. The great head towered above the man who faced it, and then darted down, the venom-dripping jaws gaping wide. But Conan had plucked a dagger from his girdle, and he stabbed upward as the head dipped down. The point tore through the lower jaw and transfixed the upper, pinning them together. The next instant, the great trunk had looped itself around the Cimmerian as the snake, unable to use its fangs, employed its remaining form of attack. Conan's left arm was pinioned among the bone-crushing folds, but his right was free. Bracing to keep upright, he stretched his hand forth and gripped the hilt of the long knife jutting from the serpent's neck and tore it free in a shower of blood. As if divining his purpose with more than bestial intelligence, the snake writhed and knotted, seeking to cast its loops about his right arm. But with the speed of light, the long knife rose and fell, shearing halfway through the reptile's giant trunk. Before he could strike again, the great pliant loops fell from him, and the monster dragged itself across the floor, gushing blood from its ghastly wounds. Conan sprang after it, knife lifted, but his vicious swipe cut empty air as the serpent writhed away from him and struck its blunted nose against a paneled screen of sandalwood. One of the panels gave inward, and the long bleeding barrel whipped through it and was gone. Conan instantly attacked the screen. A few blows rent it apart, and he glared into the dim alcove above. No horrific shape coiled there. There was blood on the marble floor, and bloody tracks led to a cryptic arched door. Those tracks were of a man's bare feet. Conan! He wheeled about, back into the chamber just in time to catch the Devi of Indeha in his arms as she rushed across the room and threw herself upon him, catching him about the neck with a frantic clasp, half hysterical with terror and gratitude and relief. His wild blood had been stirred to its uttermost by all that had passed. He caught her to him in a grasp that would have made her wince at another time, and crushed her lips with his. She made no resistance. The Devi was drowned in the elemental woman. She closed her eyes and drank in his fierce, hot, lawless kisses with the abandon of passionate thirst. She was panting with his violence when he ceased for breath, and glared down at her lying limp in his mighty arms. "I knew you'd come for me," she murmured. "You would not leave me in this den of devils." At her words, recollection of their environment came to him suddenly. He lifted his head and listened intently. Silence reigned over the castle of Yzma, but it was a silence impregnated with menace. Peril crouched in every corner, leered invisibly from every hanging. "We'd better go while we can," he muttered. "Those cuts were enough to kill any common beast or man, but a wizard has a dozen lives. Wound one, and he writhes away like a crippled snake to soak up fresh venom from some source of sorcery." He picked up the girl, and carrying her in his arms like a child, he strode out into the gleaming jade corridor and down the stairs, nerves tautly alert for any sign or sound. I met the master, she whispered, clinging to him and shuddering. He worked his spells on me to break my will. The most awful thing was a moldering corpse which seized me in its arms. I fainted then and lay as one dead, I do not know for how long. Shortly after I regained consciousness, I heard sounds of strife below, and cries, and then that snake came slithering through the curtains. Ah! She shook at the memory of that horror. I knew somehow that it was not an illusion, but a real serpent that sought my life. It was not a shadow, at least, answered Conan cryptically. He knew he was beaten, and chose to slay you rather than let you be rescued. What do you mean, he? She asked uneasily, and then shrank against him, crying out, and forgetting her question. She had seen the corpses at the foot of the stairs. Those of the seers were not good to look at, as they lay twisted and contorted, their hands and feet were exposed to view, and at the sight Yasmina went livid and hid her face against Conan's powerful shoulder. Chapter 10. Yasmina and Conan. Conan passed through the hall quickly enough, traversed the outer chamber, and approached the door that led upon the gallery. Then he saw the floor sprinkled with tiny glittering shards. The crystal sheet that had covered the doorway had been shivered to bits, and he remembered the crash that accompanied the shattering of the crystal globe. He believed that every piece of crystal in the castle had broken at that instant, and some dim instinct or memory of esoteric lore vaguely suggested the truth of that monstrous connection between the lords of the Black Circle and the golden pomegranates. He felt the short hair bristle chilly at the back of his neck and put the matter hastily out of his mind. He breathed a deep sigh of relief as he stepped out upon the green jade gallery. There was still the gorge to cross, but at least he could see the white peaks glistening in the sun, and the long slopes falling away into the distant blue hazes. The Irek'zai lay where he had fallen, an ugly blotch on the glassy smoothness. As Conan strode down the winding path, he was surprised to note the position of the sun. It had not yet passed its zenith, yet it seemed to him that hours had passed since he plunged into the castle of the Black Seers. He felt an urge to hasten, not a mere blind panic, but an instinct of peril growing behind his back. He said nothing to Yasmina, and she seemed content to nestle her dark head against his arching breast and find security in the clasp of his iron arms. He paused an instant on the brink of the chasm, frowning down. The haze which danced in the gorge was no longer rose-hued and sparkling. It was smoky, dim, ghostly, like the life tide that flickered thinly in a wounded man. The thought came vaguely to Conan that the spells of magicians were more closely bound to their personal beings than were the actions of common men to the actors. But far below, the floor shone like tarnished silver, and the gold threads sparkled undimmed. Conan shifted Yasmina across his shoulder, where she lay docilely, and began the descent. Hurriedly he descended the ramp, and hurriedly he fled across the echoing floor. He had a conviction that they were racing with time, that their chance of survival depended upon crossing the gorge of horrors before the wounded master of the castle should regain enough power to loose some other doom upon them. When he toiled up the farthest ramp and came out upon the crest, he breathed a gusty sigh of relief and stood Yasmina upon her feet. "You walk from here," he told her. "It's downhill all the way." She stole a glance at the gleaming pyramid across the chasm. It reared up against the snowy slope like the citadel of silence and immemorial evil. "Are you a magician that you have conquered the Black Seers of Yishma, Conan of Gore?" she asked as they went down the path, and his heavy arm about her supple waist. "It was a girdle Kemsa gave me before he died," Conan answered. "Yes, I found him on the trail. It is a curious one, which I'll show you when I have time. Against some spells it was weak, but against others it was strong. And a good knife is always a hearty incantation." "But if the girdle aided you in conquering the master," she argued, "why did it not aid Kemsa?" He shook his head. "Who knows, but Kemsa had been the master's slave. Perhaps that weakened its magic. He had no hold on me as he had on Kemsa, yet I can't say that I conquered him. He retreated, but I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of him. I want to put as many miles between us and his lair as we can." He was further relieved to find horses tethered among the tamarisks as he had left them. He loosed them swiftly and mounted the black stallion, swinging the girl up before him. The others followed, freshened by the rest. "And what now?" she asked. "To Afghulistan?" "Not just now," he grinned heartily. "Somebody, maybe the governor, killed my 7 headmen. My idiotic followers think I had something to do with it, and unless I am able to convince them otherwise, they'll hunt me like a wounded jackal." "Then what of me? If the headmen are dead, I am useless to you as a hostage. Will you slay me to avenge them?" He looked down at her, with eyes fiercely aglow, and laughed at the suggestion. "Then let us ride to the border," she said. "You'll be safe from the Afghulis there." "Yes, on a Vendehan gibbet." "I am the Queen of Vendeha," she reminded him, with a touch of her old imperiousness. "You have saved my life. You shall be rewarded." She did not intend it as it sounded, but he growled in his throat, ill-pleased. "Keep your bounty for your city-bred dogs, princess. If you're a queen of the plains, I'm a chief of the hills, and not 1 foot toward the border I will take you." "But you would be safe," she began bewilderedly. "And you'd be the Devi again," he broke in. "No, girl, I prefer you as you are now, a woman of flesh and blood riding on my saddlebow." "But you can't keep me," she cried. "You can't." "Watch and see," he advised grimly. "But I will pay you a vast ransom." "Devi, take your ransom," he answered roughly, his arms hardening about her supple figure. "The kingdom of Vendeha could give me nothing I desire half so much as I desire you. I took you at the risk of my neck. If your courtiers want you back, let them come up the Zybar and fight for you." "But you have no followers now," she protested. "You are hunted. How can you preserve your own life, much less mine?" "I still have friends in the hills," he answered. "There is a chief of the Kuraksai who will keep you safely while I bicker with the Afghulis. If they will have none of me, by Krom I will ride northward with you to the steppes and the Kozakai. I was a hetman among the free companions before I rode southward. I'll make you a queen upon the Zaporoska River." "But I cannot," she objected. "You must not hold me." "If the idea is so repulsive," he demanded, "why did you yield your lips to me so willingly?" "Even a queen is human," she answered, coloring. "But because I am a queen, I must consider my kingdom. Do not carry me away into some foreign country. Come back to Vendeha with me." "Would you make me your king?" he asked sardonically. "Well, there are customs," she stammered, and he interrupted her with a hard laugh. "Yes, civilized customs that won't let you do as you wish. You'll marry some withered old king of the plains, and I can go on my way with only the memory of a few kisses snatched from your lips. Ha!" "But I must return to my kingdom," she repeated helplessly. "Why?" he demanded angrily. "To chafe your rump on gold thrones and listen to the plaudits of smirking, velvet-skirted fools? Where is the gain? Listen, I was born in the Sumerian hills where the people are all barbarians. I have been a mercenary soldier, a corsair, a Kozak, and 100 of other things. What king has roamed the countries, fought the battles, loved the women, and won the plunder that I have? I came into Gulistan to raise a horde and plunder the kingdoms to the south, your own among them. Being chief of the Afghulis was only a start. If I can consolidate them, we'll have a dozen tribes following me within a year. But if I can't, I'll ride back to the steppes and loot the Turanian borders with the Kozakai. And you'll go with me. To the devil with your kingdom. They fended for themselves before you were born." She lay in his arms, looking up at him, and she felt a tug at her spirit, a lawless, reckless urge that matched his own, and was by it called into being. But 1,000 generations of sovereignship rode heavy upon her. I can't, she repeated helplessly. "You haven't a choice," he assured her. What the devil?" They had left Yzma some miles behind and were riding along a high ridge that separated the 2 deep valleys. They had just topped a steep crest when they could gaze down into the valley to their right hand. and there was a running fight in progress. A strong wind was blowing away from them, carrying the sounds from their ears, but even so, the clashing of steel and thunder of hooves welled up far below. They saw the glint of the sun on lance-tip-inspired helmets. The 3,000 mailed horsemen were driving before them a ragged band of turbaned riders who fled snarling and striking like fleeing wolves. "Turanians," muttered Conan. "Squadrons from Sakarndam. What the devil are they doing here?"
"Who are the men they pursue?" asked Yasmina, "and why do they fall back so stubbornly? They cannot stand against such odds."
500 of my mad Afghulis," he growled, scowling down into the vale. "They're in a trap, and they know it." The valley was indeed a cul-de-sac at that end. It narrowed to a high-walled gorge, opening out further into a round bowl, completely rimmed with lofty, unscalable walls. The turbaned riders were being forced into this gorge, because there was nowhere else for them to go, and they went reluctantly, in a shower of arrows and a whirl of swords. The helmeted riders harried them, but did not press in too rashly. They knew the desperate fury of the hill tribes, and they knew, too, that they had their prey in a trap from which there was no escape. They had recognized the hill men as Afghulis, and they wished to hem them in and force a surrender. They needed hostages for the purpose they had in mind. Their emir was a man of decision and initiative. When he reached the Gurashah Valley and found neither guides nor emissary waiting for him, he pushed on, trusting to his own knowledge of the country. All the way from Sakarndam there had been fighting, and tribesmen were licking their wounds in many a crag-perched village. He knew there was a good chance that neither he nor any of his helmeted spearmen would ever ride through the gates of Sakarndam again, for the tribes would be all up behind him now. But he was determined to carry out his orders, which were to take Yasmina Devi from the Afghulis at all costs, and to bring her captives to Sakarndam, or if confronted by impossibility, to strike off her head before he himself died. Of all of this, of course, the watchers on the ridge were not aware, but Conan fidgeted with nervousness. "Why the devil did they get themselves trapped?" he demanded of the universe at large. "I know what they're doing in these parts. They were hunting me, the dogs, poking into every valley, and found themselves penned in before they knew it. The poor fools! They're making a stand in the gorge, but they can't hold out for long. When the Turanians have pushed them back into the bowl, they'll slaughter them at their leisure." The din welling up from below increased in volume and intensity. In the strait of the narrow gut, the Afghulis, fighting desperately, were for the time holding their own against the mailed riders who could not throw their whole weight against them. Conan scowled darkly, moved restlessly, fingering his hilt, and finally spoke bluntly. "Devi, I must go down to them. I'll find a place for you to hide until I come back to you. You spoke of your kingdom. Well, I don't pretend to look on those hairy devils as my children, but after all, such as they are, they're my henchmen. A chief should never desert his followers, even if they desert him first. They think they were right in kicking me out. Hell, I won't be cast off. I'm still chief of the Afghulis, and I'll prove it. I can climb down on foot into the gorge."
"But what of me?" she queried. "You carried me away forcibly from my people. Now will you leave me to die in the hills alone while you go down and sacrifice yourself uselessly?"
His veins swelled with the conflict of his emotions. "That's right," he muttered helplessly. "Crom knows what I can do." She turned her head slightly, a curious expression dawning on her beautiful face. Then,
"Listen!" she cried. "Listen!"
A distant fanfare of trumpets was borne faintly to their ears. They stared into the deep valley on the left and caught a glint of steel on the further side. A long line of lances and polished helmets moved along the vale, gleaming in the sunlight.
"The riders of Vendeha!" she cried exultantly.
"There are thousands of them," muttered Conan. "It has been long since a Kshatriya host has ridden this far into the hills."
"They are searching for me," she exclaimed. "Give me your horse. I will ride to my warriors. The ridge is not so precipitous on the left, and I can reach the valley floor. I will lead my horsemen into the valley on the upper end and fall upon the Turanians. We will crush them in the vice. Quick, Conan, will you sacrifice your men to your own desire? The burning hunger of the steppes and the wintry forest glared out of his eyes, but he shook his head and swung off the stallion, placing the reins in her hands. You win, he grunted. Ride like the devil. She wheeled away down the left-hand slope, and he ran swiftly along the ridge until he reached the long, ragged cleft that was the defile in which the fight raged. Down the rugged wall he scrambled like an ape, clinging to projections and crevices, to fall at last, feet first, into the melee that raged in the mouth of the gorge. Blades were whickering and clanging about him, horses rearing and stamping, helmet plumes nodding among turbans that were stained crimson. As he hit, he yelled like a wolf, caught a gold-worked rein, dodging the sweep of a scimitar, and drove his long knife upward through the rider's vitals. In another instant he was in the saddle, yelling ferocious orders to the Afghulis. They stared at him stupidly for an instant. Then, as they saw the havoc his steed was wreaking among their enemies, they fell to their work again, accepting him without comment. In that inferno of licking blades and spurting blood, there was no time to ask or answer questions. The riders in their spired helmets and gold-worked hauberks swarmed about the gorge mouth, thrusting and slashing, and the narrow defile was packed and jammed with horses and men. The warriors crushed breast to breast, stabbing with shortened blades, slashing murderously when there was an instant's room to swing a sword. When a man went down, he did not get up from beneath the stamping, swirling hooves. Weight and sheer strength counted heavily there, and the chief of the Afghulis did the work of 10. At such times, accustomed habits sway men strongly, and the warriors, who were used to seeing Conan in their vanguard, were heartened mightily, despite their distrust of him. But the superior numbers counted too. The pressure of the men behind forced the horsemen of Turan deeper and deeper into the gorge, into the teeth of the flickering tulwars. Foot by foot the Afghulis were shoved back, leaving the defile floor carpeted with dead, on which the riders trampled. As he hacked and smote like a man possessed, Conan had time for some chilling doubts. Would Yasmina keep her word? She had but to join her warriors, turn southward, and leave him and his band to perish. But at last, after what seemed centuries of desperate battling, in the valley outside there rose another sound above the clash of steel and yells of slaughter. And then, with a burst of trumpets that shook the walls and rushing thunder of hooves, 5,000 riders of Bandeja smote the host of Securendum. That stroke split the Turanian squadrons asunder, shattered, tore, and rent them and scattered their fragments all over the valley. In an instant, the surge had ebbed back out of the gorge. There was a chaotic, confused swirl of fighting, horsemen wheeling and smiting singly and in clusters, and then the emir went down with the Kashtraya lance through his breast, and the riders in their spired helmets turned their horses down the valley, spurring like mad and seeking to slash away through the swarms which had come upon them from the rear. As they scattered in flight, the conquerors scattered in pursuit, and all across the valley floor, and up the slopes near the mouth and over the crests streamed the fugitives and the pursuers. The Afghulis, those left to ride, rushed out of the gorge and joined in the harrying of their foes, accepting the unexpected alliance as unquestioningly as they had accepted the return of their repudiated chief. The sun was sinking towards the distant crags when Conan, his garments hacked to tatters and the mail under them reeking and clotted with blood, his knife dripping and crusted to the hilt, strode over the corpses to where Yasmina Devi sat her horse among her nobles on the crest of the ridge, near a lofty precipice. "You kept your word, Devi," he roared. "By Crom, though, I had some bad seconds down in that gorge. Look out!" Down from the sky swooped a vulture of tremendous size with a thunder of wings that knocked men sprawling from their horses. The scimitar-like beak was slashing for the Devi's soft neck, but Conan was quicker. A short run, a tigerish leap, the savage thrust of a dripping knife, and the vulture voiced a horribly human cry, pitched sideways, and went tumbling down the cliffs to the rocks and river 1,000 feet below. As it dropped, its black wings thrashing the air, it took on the semblance, not of a bird, but of a black-robed human body that fell, arms and wide black sleeves thrown abroad. Conan turned to Yasmina, his red knife still in his hand, his blue eyes smoldering, blood oozing from wounds on his thickly muscled arms and thighs. "You are the Devi again," he said, grinning fiercely at the gold-clasped gossamer robe she had donned over her hill girl attire, and awed not at all by the imposing array of chivalry about him. "I have you to thank for the lives of some 350 of my rogues, who are at least convinced that I didn't betray them. You have put my hands on the rein of conquest again." "I still owe you my ransom," she said, her dark eyes glowing as they swept over him. 10,000 pieces of gold I will pay you." He made a savage, impatient gesture, shook the blood from his knife, and thrust it back in its scabbard, wiping his hands on his mail. "I will collect your ransom in my own way, at my own time," he said. "I will collect it in your place at Idaoda, and I will come with 50,000 men to see that the scales are fair." She laughed, gathering her reins into her hands. "And I will meet you on the shores of Jamunda with 100,000. His eyes shone with fierce appreciation and admiration, and stepping back, he lifted his hand with a gesture that was like the assumption of kingship, indicating that her road was clear before her. And thus ends the People of the Black Circle. I hope that you have enjoyed this. If you have managed to stay with me this far, I greatly appreciate it. Once more, if you can like and subscribe if you are not already, and comment down below on what you would like me to read next. I've gotten a few suggestions so far from some people, and I shall begin working on those shortly. You should expect another video up within the next day or two. Thank you all again for listening, and have a wonderful and blessed day.